Just in case you weren't here 2 weeks ago or last week, I want to catch you up to where we are. We closed our Easter gathering by me asking everyone to assign themselves a number. And this would be a number that's based upon faith in a very specific piece or claim of the Bible. And that is the historical or non-historical resurrection of Jesus. And so what we said was, you just need to come up with a number. We're going to put it on a sliding scale. And so if you're a 1, this is what a 1 sounds like. A 1 says, hey, the resurrection of Jesus is closer to a fairy tale than anything. It's a really great story. It's more like a Disney movie type thing. Like, it makes me feel good about myself, those kind of things. But I mean, it's not legitimate. It's just a story. It's a great story, but it's not legit. So that's what a 1 is. A 5 on the sliding scale, if you come over this way, a 5 would be, hey, I believe that Jesus Christ of Nazareth is the Son of God, and that he died on a Roman cross, and he died a legitimate physical death, that his brain activity stopped, that his heart stopped beating, that the oxygen left his system, that he was medically dead. He was taken off the cross, put into a tomb, and on Sunday, that same body that was absolutely dead and had started to decompose, the process of decomposition and death was reversed in resurrection through a supernatural miracle, and that Jesus walked out on the very same feet that nails were driven through while he was on the cross just 3 days prior. And that same Jesus is, because of those things, the Son of God, right? And that whole piece happens because there's a connection with the Son of God, a sin issue we have, and his death on the cross. So that's what a 5 looks like. And so I just said, hey, I want everyone to put themselves on a scale of 1 to 5. And honestly, it wasn't something we asked everyone to raise your hand and identify as. I just wanted you to say, hey, this is my number, right? Nothing wrong with where your number is. I think you owe it to yourself to identify, this is where I'm at on this issue, 1 to 5. And then I followed that ask up with, hey, I would like for you to come up with some questions or some thoughts, some ideas that are standing in between you moving from where you currently are on your number, one step closer to being a 5, right? And so we put a QR code on the screen, and we just said, hey, scan the QR code, and then you can submit an anonymous question that just simply states, hey, this is one of my obstacles. I've got to have an answer to this for me to take a step in the other direction, right, towards a 5. If you're not a 1, 2, 3, or 4, what would those questions be? And we had over 110 questions that were submitted in 24 hours that we have broken into some pretty large categories. Thankfully, all of them weren't just like completely independent questions, because 112 weeks is a long time to do one big, huge series. But we were able to put them in some really large A lot of questions were almost identical to one another. And if not identical, they're pieces of one bigger question that can be put into one decent-sized category. And so we just cleared the teaching schedule and said, we're going to walk through these larger categories one at a time for the next 6 weeks or so. And so last week, we got to a place where we started with the first category. First question was, is what we read in the Bible reliable? In other words, is what was written originally by the people who lived in the first century, is that what we read today? Is it reliable? And so maybe it's a game of telephone, right? Where what it starts and the way it finishes are two completely different things. It's been 2,000 years or so since the New Testament portion of this was written. And so we're asking the question, are we reading, what are the chances we're reading what was actually written? And we walked through that answer. And then the second thing, though, was it's not enough just to know if we're reading what they wrote originally. The other question is can it be trusted? In other words, are the people and places that are listed there, are they real people and places? And is there any evidence, not in the Bible itself, that gives proof that the Bible is actually a trustworthy document? And we went all through those things, right? And so that was last week. So if you want the answer to those questions, I don't have time to do them today because we did it last week. And so you can go back and watch and kind of come to your own conclusion in terms of how we discussed and walked through that very specific piece. This is week 2. And week 2 is It's a big one. So I'll be perfectly honest with you. I had no idea how much work this was going to be to pull off answering these questions week after week for 6. I had no clue. In week 2, it's just been exhausting. And it's not exhausting because the content is difficult. It's exhausting because the content is so much. There's just so much out there. And to figure out how do we take it and put it into, I've got 24 minutes and 25 seconds left before I'm supposed to be done. And I usually abuse that pretty well. And so we're going to go a little over it, but we can't go too far past, you know what I'm saying, because people start to get hungry. And so here's the thing. Week 2. Science, miracles, and the Bible. How do they add up? Science, miracles, and the Bible. How do they all add up? Let's start by defining miracle. Miracle is defined as a surprising and welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws and is therefore considered to be the work of a divine agency, right? Miracle. A miracle. Now, here's the thing. This is a problem for a lot of people. In fact, if you look throughout church history, this has been a problem in the church where there's been periods of the church where entire organizations or parts of the church as a whole has tried to figure out how do we separate the goodness of Jesus from the ideas that miracles happen, because they just couldn't even figure out, even in the church at times, how to make the two go hand in hand. And so they would try to separate them and say, well, this explains this. We don't have to listen to this particular part, right? And when you look at Jesus' life, you can't separate them. There's over 30 instances, like 30-ish instances of Jesus doing something miraculous. And when we look at those, we see things like he healed people, there were exorcisms, raising the dead, he rescued people, there were gifts that were given. I mean, when you think through Jesus, how do you explain how someone can spit in the dirt and rub mud on someone's eyes that's blind, and then they can wash that out, and then they can see? Or even better, how do you explain how Jesus decides, you know what, this is a perfectly good lake, I'm just going to walk across it, you know? Like, I'm just going to walk on water. Now, we've all probably tried to walk on water. We probably have tried it. You know, you go to a pool and you think if you get a fast enough running head start, maybe you can just, it doesn't work though. You know what I'm talking about? None of y'all tried that, just me? Okay, all right. You know, I thought it'd be worth a shot. It doesn't work. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't work. So how do you explain it? It makes no sense. You know, I think what's really interesting is, and again, I'm only going to spend a small part on the Bible, and I need to move out of the Bible because honestly, whoever asked this many questions about this particular topic, what you're not asking is what the Bible says, because that's part of the issue, right? So I don't want to use the Bible to prove it, but I do want to talk about what the Bible says about it, and then we're going to move into some other pieces. One of the guys who records a lot of Jesus' miracles is a guy by the name of Luke. Luke, when I refer to Luke, when we talk about what he writes two very significant portions of the New Testament. He writes a gospel or his own account of the life of Jesus called the Gospel of Luke. And then he also writes another book that follows the birth of the church, which we abbreviate to the book of Acts, or the long version is Acts of the Apostles. And Luke was a historian, and what we found, if you go back and listen to last week, in particular, if you took me serious and read some of the book that we referenced last week or had for sale, or you got to go and kind of look at it on your own, maybe download it off Audible, you will find that Luke has been elevated as a historian among other historians that are not Christians because of the accuracy in which he depicts the Roman Empire in the first century. That there's a lot of things that Luke talks about in his own accounts that people throughout the centuries have said that cannot be true. We've never found any evidence in the Roman Empire of these people or these places. Yet, as biblical archaeology really got its enormous start in the 1950s when Israel became a recognized and official state in the Middle East. When that happened, biblical archaeology really picked up steam, and they started finding the things that Luke had referenced. And now a lot of other historians use the Gospel of Luke as reference points and the first people talking about some of these things they are just now discovering. But in addition to Luke being a historian, that wasn't his job. Luke's vocation was a doctor. And so when we look at how he writes the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, he uses a lot of medical terminology, which is interesting that a medical doctor would approach some of these healings from the stance or the position of someone who does medicine. And when he begins to write about it, he doesn't just glance over it like, okay, well, and then he was blind, right? He's using medical language and medical terms. And so whatever Jesus was doing, it was good enough to fool even someone who practiced medicine for a living. It wasn't just Jesus that the Bible claims did miracles, though. It actually says that he sent his followers out to do miracles. In Luke 9:1-2 says this: when Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. So it wasn't just a claim that Jesus did something supernatural. It was also, the Bible claims, that he gave some of his closest friends the opportunity and power and authority to do the very same thing. The question is, why? Like, why miracles? Why were miracles important? What role did they serve? Well, we actually have a little bit of an answer. There's a guy by the name of Peter who was one of Jesus' closest friends that spent 3+ years with Jesus, following him and watching these things. He's having a conversation with a group of skeptics. And this is what he says: fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. And so Peter's talking to this group that's not quite sure what they believe or what they're going to do about the resurrected Jesus, or at least the claim of the resurrection of Jesus. But he stands up in front of them and says, hey, guys, I know you are skeptical, but here's the truth. You know without a shadow of a doubt, you watched the wonders and signs. And the reason he did that, it says, because God accredited him. In other words, he brought legitimacy to what Jesus was doing through the wonders and signs. And you all saw it. He's talking to skeptics. He's not talking to a bunch of believers who are all in on Jesus. He said, God did them among you through him. And you know this. But again, yeah, the Bible claims miracles are real. But we can't use the Bible to prove what the Bible says. Right? We can't do that. So then we have to ask, how do we prove it? Well, I think it begins with the right question. And honestly, I'm not sure we're asking the best first question. I don't think the best first question is, how does miracles and science line up with the Bible? I think there's a better first question that will help us answer all of those questions. And that is this: is there a God? Because the truth is, if we can establish that there's a God, and then we can assign a definition to God, I'd be willing to bet that that definition will allow for the supernatural. Now, maybe not, but I would like to go on a journey of discovery this morning that attempts to ask the question, is there a God? And if there is one, what is his definition? To answer that, I think we've got to look at one of the most complex miracles that we are even aware of, whether it's through written history or our own minds, and that is creation. If there's a God that created everything, then it seems to reason taking someone's eyes that don't function properly and allowing them to function properly is pretty easy. Helping someone whose legs have stopped working or never worked and causing them to work becomes pretty easy if you created everything. Let's start with the beginning. The Bible claims this is creation. In Genesis 1:1-2, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now, I want to read that to you again, but this time I want to ask you to just appease me, and I want you to close your eyes while I read it. And this time I want you to imagine what it actually looks like. So I think a lot of times when we think through creation, we think through the finished product, like, man, this is what it looks like. But I just want to read the very beginning, and I would ask, just close your eyes as I read it, and I just want you to picture, what's the image, what are you seeing according to what the Bible claims happened in the beginning? I'll read it to you. You can close your eyes if you want to be my friend. Genesis 1, 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. What do you see when you think the earth was formless? What do you see when you hear the words, and it was empty, and there was darkness, and the very Spirit of God was hovering? What does that sound like? You see, the truth is, the Bible claims that there was a beginning to everything that exists, and that the cause of that beginning was God. In other words, before God created, there was nothing. That it was just God, and it was only God, and that God was very content. And then God made a decision to create. And then in that moment, there was a beginning. A beginning not to God, but a beginning to what was created. Now we enjoy the finished product of that creation. Like we are on the backside of all of the work that it took to put creation in motion. And so the question becomes, if we're going to take this route in terms of miracles and understanding God, is there any scientific evidence or argument or thought process that we can allow our minds to wander through that brings us to a valid conclusion that the Bible is actually telling us the truth? And the truth is yeah, there's plenty. And this is where the hard work comes in, because there's so much out there for us to digest. Honestly, it becomes a little chaotic. And so I only want to take a stab at one simple, I believe, digestible argument, process for us to walk through. It's referred to as the Kalam cosmological argument. Kalam is an Arabic word which means science of discourse. This argument originated in Islamic philosophy about 1,100 years ago. So it's been around for a long time. So kalam is an Arabic word which means science of discourse. Cosmological, well, you know what that word means. It means the study of beauty, skin, hair, and nails, that kind of thing. Man, see, that's cosmetology, by the way. I thought that was a lot funnier than it was. I tried it at the 9. The 9 didn't laugh at all. I thought maybe it was just because they were asleep, but you just proved it's not that funny. In my mind this week, that was hilarious. just letting you know. I was brilliant. Yeah, somebody told me I shouldn't try it again. I didn't listen. About 40 years ago, a guy by the name of Dr. William Lane Craig gave a little bit of a resurgence to this particular argument. Let me lay it out for you and hopefully walk us through kind of where we're at today. Here is his argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. That's it. It's really simple, right? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And so in order for one of these arguments to be true, the third piece rests on the truth of the first two. And so premise 1 and premise 2, we've got to walk through and kind of come to a place where we ask, can sentence 1 and sentence 2 be proven to be true? And if they can, then sentence 3 is by default true, because it's the result of the first two being accurate and true. So let's begin to prove number 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. In other words, there was something before that existed that caused it. Now, the truth is, something that is popping into existence for us that just comes out of nowhere, it never happens. We don't see that happening in our world. Now, we might pretend that it happens, and you've probably been there. Like, you've been at Target, and you're backing out of the parking space, and you hit someone. Well, when the police show up, you say, well, they came out of nowhere, which is not actually true. They didn't just pop into existence. What we really mean is we weren't paying attention. We were adjusting our Spotify playlist, screaming at 17 kids in the car, and I was trying not to beat them, and then all of a sudden I ran into someone, and it's their fault. That's what we mean, but we can't actually tell the cop that. We just say, oh, they weren't there, and then they were there. But we don't actually mean they just popped out of nowhere. I mean, even if we think through magic, if a magician pulls a bunny out of a hat, even if the bunny just actually magically appeared, it's still caused by the magician and the fancy hat. There's not things that just exist. Now, there is some science at the moment where people are saying we've got this vacuum that we've created, and inside this vacuum there are particles that just appear and disappear and appear and disappear and appear and disappear. And like that is proof that some things do just pop into existence. The problem with that argument is that they created the vacuum where the particles exist and appear and disappear. And so if they hadn't created the vacuum, would those happen? In other words, if they hadn't caused the right conditions for that to happen, would it have happened? The answer is no. No, they wouldn't. Well, as we think through this idea of our own everyday experience and the scientific evidence that we have, honestly, the first sentence in this argument, the first premise, the first proof, is actually the easiest one to prove. Yeah, things don't just pop into existence. That there's always a cause. That's easy, right? Premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's honestly a no-brainer. The second premise, though, this is where it gets difficult. This is where it gets complex. The statement, the universe began to exist. How do you prove this? The truth is, most atheists believe the universe is eternal, that it's just always been. That there's always just been something somewhere floating, whether it's dust, debris, or who knows what. It's just always been there. The problem that we have with this theory of, well, I just assume it's always been, are things that we've discovered in science, one of them being the second law of thermodynamics, which is this, that the universe is slowly running out of usable energy. In other words, if the universe is running down out of something, it can't be eternal. If it were eternal, you wouldn't run out of energy, right? Like that's the deal. If it was eternal, it's always been and it always will be. One agnostic astronomer said this: once hydrogen has been burned within that star and converted to heavier elements, it can never be restored to its original state. Thus, minute by minute, and year by year, as hydrogen is used up in the stars, the supply of this element grows smaller. And if it's running out, that means it has an end. And if it has an end, that means it has a beginning. But honestly, that's not enough. That starts to get us in the right direction, but there's a lot more. In 1915, there was a guy by the name of Albert Einstein. You've probably heard of him. He has this theory of general relativity, which helps us understand how motion and the movement of light and the passing of time interact with one another. And honestly, his theory of relativity allowed for some really great in-depth conversations and further understanding for how our world and our universe works. In fact, we still use that today. I mean, it's been the majority of it is still used today. Now, that theory of relativity was used in 1922 by two guys, Alexander Friedman and George Latimer. And they were using Einstein's theory, and they began to work on those theories, and they started to predict that it appears like the universe is expanding. Eventually, this leads to a theory that all of us know today as the Big Bang. There was a series of discoveries that were happening almost simultaneously and then a little bit afterwards that lead us to one of the most incredible breakthroughs that we've had in terms of science and the possibility of there being a God. And it started with this idea of the period luminosity scale. Henrietta Leavitt actually came up and discovered this. And what she saw is that when she looked at the night sky, that there were some stars that when they were twinkling, the word she would use was when they were pulsing, that the pulsing from them were different. Some of them pulsed for longer, like the right? And then some were teeny tiny, ding, 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 that kind of thing. I don't think they make that noise, but that's, you know what I'm saying? And she noticed, hey, there's a big difference. Why is this different? And as she started to look into it, she realized that stars with longer pulses are brighter than those with shorter pulses. And this allowed astronomers to calculate the distance to stars from Earth based upon their brightness. Now that discovery led to a second discovery. A guy by the name of Vesto Slipher, he was also an astrologer, and he was studying stars and the light that they emit and how they could be split into colors on a spectrum in terms of the elements that they inhabit and they give off. And I've got a picture of it that we're going to put up on screen. And so when you take a look at this is the spectrum that we have. And on the top is just a normal, like, hey, each one of those, or this is the elements we see from a star. Each one of the black lines on the top row represents an element, and that's the composition of the light that we see. Now, on the bottom row of the picture, you can see that the pattern is the same. In other words, the composition is the same, but for some reason, the black lines don't line up on this particular star as opposed to this particular star. But the composition, the actual, see how the black lines, proportionally, they're the same. So it's the same elements, just they're on a different place in the spectrum. He refers to this as a principle called red shift, which when they discovered it, they realized that the reason that the contents are the same, but the spectrum is different, is because the things that are shifted to the red are actually moving away from us. And by contrast, if something's moving in our direction, there's a blue shift where it shifts to the blue side of the spectrum. Well, what he started to discover was that almost everything that he looked at in terms of other galaxies all had a red shift. In other words, all of them were moving away from us. In 1929, a guy by the name of Edwin Hubble, his observation was that the red shift of galaxies was directly proportional to the distance of the galaxy from Earth. The further away they were, the faster they were moving, and all consistently across the board. In other words, the universe must be expanding. It's not just a theory anymore from 20 years earlier. Now it's confirmed. The universe is expanding. But not only is it expanding, it's also expanding from a singular starting point. Because it's all proportional, it's like if you were to take a balloon and you were to put little stickers all over the balloon, right? Anywhere you want to, put stickers all over the balloon. And you were to blow the balloon up, the stickers stay in the same place in the balloon. They just keep getting further and further apart. Now let's pretend that you could put as much air as you wanted to in the balloon and it would actually blow up, right? You could just continue to blow the balloon up, and proportionally they would continue to get further and further away from where they started. And that's what they were seeing with these galaxies that were moving opposite or away from us as we were expanding in the same direction in the opposite way. Now, the conclusion from this is that if they're all moving away from each other proportionally, and the further they get, the faster they go, well, what happens if we reverse this? Like, where did it start? Well, if they bring it all back, it all begins to condense into one big, enormous, dense piece of matter, is what science would say. And that eventually this dense piece of matter, this starting point, they refer to it as the initial singularity, and that it's just all matter compacted into one big, enormous space. And then that big, enormous space contracts and it becomes a teeny tiny space. And eventually it just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And science continues to show, man, that it just gets smaller and it gets denser and it gets heavier and it gets more compact. The problem is eventually they run out of space to get smaller. All the mathematical equations, eventually you run out of numbers to express how small this piece of matter can get. And so then the question is, well, then what was happening? If it's always contracting, while it's always, in terms of, if it was always contracting in terms of where it started, and now it's always expanding, how small can it get? Well, we run out of numbers to tell how small it can get. And we begin to use something that we refer to as imaginary numbers, which are not real. That's imaginary. It's just a guess. And so then they ask the question, if we've run out of numbers, and mathematically and scientifically we don't have an explanation for what comes before this teeny tiny little piece, what could it possibly be other than it doesn't go infinitely backwards because it can only get so small? There was a starting point, or there was a beginning. Premise 2, the universe had a beginning. It doesn't go infinitely into the past, even if we strictly just want to talk about science. And so the conclusion is, therefore, the universe has a cause. Well, honestly, I think we should probably do a little bit more work on the cause part, just because as followers of Jesus, I don't want to just take 1 + 1 = 2. Let's dive into what is 2 really. So what or who caused the beginning of the universe? Well, in order to stay with the scientific definition, to meet all of the requirements to make this thing happen, this singularity, this place that everything begins, there is a definition that has to be attributed to this. And it has to be something or someone who is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and all-powerful. By definition, that's whatever this thing has to be. Right? Spaceless, it has no limits. Boundless, occupying no space. It's got to be timeless. It can't have a beginning or an end. It's got to be immaterial, or it's got to be spiritual rather than physical. It's got to be uncaused, nothing before it, because it has always been. It's got to be all-powerful. It cannot have limits. This is the definition of whatever this thing or this person is. Now, truth is, though, we actually have a name for this definition. It's God. It's God. So if you believe that God exists, the truth is, miracles are easy to believe in. If miracles are your issue, the truth is, miracles really aren't your actual issue. God is. I will say this, though. We do have to be careful. We have to be careful when we go to God and say, hey, I demand that you give me a sign so that I can believe in you. We've got to be careful with that. There's a couple of instances in the Bible that happens. I want to just give you one of Jesus' response to that moment. He says this, "It is an evil and unfaithful generation that craves for a sign, and no sign will be given to it." Now, Jesus goes on to say that I'm going to give you a sign, and he refers to his own resurrection. He talks about spending time in the tomb and walking out of it. There's no doubt that Jesus wanted the miracle to be his physical resurrection. And when we look through history, we see an incredible reaction to something. We see a band of misfits that are maybe 100, 120 or so folks that have gotten all in on this Jesus thing, but honestly, it shrinks a little bit, and they're not really sure what's happening. We got for sure 11, and then we got some ladies, and all of a sudden, something happens, and from that something, it begins to explode and expand, and about 7 or 8 weeks later, it grows to about 3,000 people from just 100 or so. And then you go a little bit further and it multiplies again, and then it multiplies again. And we're 2,000 years into this, and there's over 1 billion walking on the planet at the moment. Not to even mention the billion or so that's existed that's already passed away, right? There are billions of people that now spring from some pivotal moment in history that no one is willing to say, I didn't see. Yeah, he for sure knew the resurrection was going to be it. And Jesus had already made a decision that the way he interacts with us now and today is different than then. Here's the thing. The truth is, when we take a look at miracles, we have to ask a couple of questions. The first one is, do we want it to be true? Like, do we want there to be miracles? Like, do we actually want that to be something that happens in our world? Do we want to find evidence that Jesus did the miraculous? Or do we want it to be a lie? Would we prefer to find evidence that it never happened? That it was just some big story, that Jesus was a great guy, and man, he got an unfortunate little untimely run-in with the Romans, and it cost him a cross and the rest of his life. But the miracle thing is not a thing. Do we want it to be a lie? Jesus decided, hey, I'm going to interact with the world a little differently. And we know this because of the evidence today. When Jesus was walking around, Jesus would go, and there would be people that were brought to him, and he would go to people, and he would just at will heal people of their issue. According to the Bible, at will heal hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, right? There were crowds that would come. They would bring their sick to him, right? And that's the way he would do it. Now, we know that that's not something that's happening today. There are a lot of people that claim it, but you've got to go to their building in their particular part of the city, and you've got to come there, or you've got to come to a place where they have put locks on the doors and they barricade the back, and you got to pay a ticket to get in. If you pay the ticket, then maybe you get to be in front of this miraculous healer, and he waves a coat over you, or he puts his hands on your forehead and he asks you to fall back. Like, there's things that happen like that, right? But nobody's going into hospital buildings and walking down the ICU or a NICU and saying, and you get healed, and you get healed, and you get healed. It just doesn't happen. It's not happening. But that's because we got an upgrade, which is difficult for us to understand. But Jesus said, I am leaving, and the area or the stage or the season or the act of, in terms of, if we look at Acts as a play, Acts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the season of church and the way that God interacts with our world today is going to be changing. And instead of you having God in the flesh walking around among you, I'm going to give you the Spirit of God that's going to dwell inside of you. And so it's different. And the way we interact in our world is different than the way Jesus did. Now, here's the thing, though. The Spirit that lives inside those who follow and give their life to Jesus, it's the same Spirit that you watched and imagined in your head in Genesis 1 and 2. Whatever you watched hover over those waters as you closed your eyes, whatever that was that you saw, that's what was promised to live inside of you. Bonus points, it's the very same Spirit that hovered in Genesis 1, verse 2, same Spirit that resurrected Jesus from the dead. That's a lot of power put in one person, put in a billion people. The truth is we see miracles every day, but we explain them away. We talk about what a coincidence, right? But God is showing up, and we've got some other way to explain what just miraculously happened. Would we recognize a miracle if we got one? I remember vividly. I was 9 or 10, so I guess I don't remember that vividly. I remember the moment. I was 9 or 10 years old. I was in my bedroom, and I was sitting on my bed. I've got a twin bed that was my grandmother's, and somehow it got handed down to me, and it was my bed. I slept in this twin bed until I graduated from college, got married, right? Just this little twin bed. My son now sleeps in this very same twin bed. I was sitting in this twin bed. Twin bed has nothing to do with the story. But I was sitting in this twin bed, and my life at the time was not going great. And so there was some divorce that had happened, and there was just a lot of stuff going on that I just I was just struggling with, really struggling with it. And I got into a place where I was a little out on whether God was legit or not. And I was struggling with it because I just didn't see any evidence. I was like, look at my life. You're not here. You're not here. And I was sitting in my bed, and I had a basketball goal, like one of them Nerf basketball goals, and it was on my wall in front of me. And right next to that basketball goal were two guys that I thought were just impressive, Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson. And they were in this framed picture, and it was autographed, Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson. In my 9 or 10-year-old brain, I thought that those were real autographs, because I had won them at a circus game, carnival game. I don't know if I won them or my dad won them. Someone won it for me, and here it goes. I had it. This was my prize for this carnival game. And in my mind, it was legitimate. It had been signed, right? And so there it goes next to my basketball goal where I would own my cousins and dunk all over everybody. They were 4 and 5, and I was 9, but that didn't matter to me, right? That's where this picture hung. And I remember sitting there in my bed, and I was looking at the picture, and I was like, you know what? That's the most valuable thing I got. It's the most important thing I got. And so I remember closing my eyes and bowing my head and saying, God, if you're real, knock the picture off the wall. And I prayed and opened my eyes, and I looked, and the picture was still hanging on the wall. And so I was like, okay, I want to try this again. And so I closed my eyes, and I prayed longer, and I told him why I needed him to knock the picture. I didn't just give him commands. I was like, this is why I'm going to give you a command in a second. Here's the case, and now you've heard my case. Please proceed with knocking the picture off the wall. If you'll do that, I'll believe you're real, right? And I say amen, and I open my eyes, and Michael and Magic are still just staring at me, hanging on the wall, And so I get a little upset with God, and I'm done closing my eyes. I'm just talking, and I'm letting him know, like, hey, look, I don't ask you for a lot, okay? Don't ask you for a lot. I'm asking you for one simple thing. Just knock the picture off the wall, right? Just knock it off the wall. I mean, you hang stars, you spin planets, like you do all these incredible things. I'm asking for one small thing. Knock the picture off the wall. Like, knock the picture off the wall, And I remember I began to cry, and I'm just begging, like, come on. Like, I really do need you to be real, okay? Like, I need you to be real. So just knock the picture off the wall. And they just stared at me. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried. And eventually I fell asleep. And I woke up in the morning with the lights on, and Michael and Magic still hanging on the wall. What do I do with that? You see, if I had gotten too tied up and hung up on the lack of a miracle, I would have missed the miracle. And the miracle I needed in that moment was not a picture to fall. The miracle was me. And if you look back at my life, there is no explanation for how I made it out in any form of anything not in handcuffs, or that I'm even still alive. It was at times an absolute disaster. And I'm certainly glad God didn't waste his miracle on a picture hanging on the wall. But instead, he answered a prayer that probably other people in my life were praying for a miracle. And he said yes to them while saying no to me. Which in reality, he was actually saying yes to me. But it took me a while to be able to see the miracle. When you ask, how do miracles sync up with what we believe? Honestly, you could spend weeks and months and years studying and going through philosophical arguments. But I would encourage you to do this. Start looking for miracles. Start looking for miracles. Instead of asking, do they exist and did they exist? Start looking for them. I think you will be surprised at what you find.